And I think it's really important to remember that what we regard as natural is actually historically contingent. So if we were born in, say, the 17th century, what we would call natural or reality would be fundamentally different. And innovation actually fundamentally shapes and shifts culture. So the development of new technologies actually fundamentally transforms the world. Let's talk about the invention of the camera in the 19th century. Prior to the camera, people wouldn't know what you looked like unless they met you. But then with the invention of the camera, you have the invention of the photograph, the invention of the image. People know who you are before actually seeing you. Similarly, the invention of the steam engine, the invention of the printing press. These kinds of things fundamentally shape the ways that humans interact with one another. And the same ways in which devices like a typewriter or a phone have a history, also concepts have a history. And I think this is really important to understand because so often people think that gender, sex, and sexuality have been fixed across time. But that's not actually true because our social and cultural conventions of what make up gender, sex, and sexuality shift across time. So even when we're saying something like women's history, that becomes complicated because this category woman is not the same across cultures, histories, and times. And that's especially the case when we talk about LGBTQ history, because lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer are recent, often 20th and 21st century ways of understanding human identity. That does not mean that there were not people who expressed desires or participated in relationships that we now call queer, but it's really important to understand that the way that they perceived themselves at that time was different. So I say that as a preface that oftentimes when I'm performing or speaking or educating people about the history of the sex binary, I'm overwhelmed with surprise that they think that this has always been the case, that we've always only had two sexes, male and female. And that's actually just not historically correct. So what I'm going to do in this lecture today is to speak to how the sex binary and why the sex binary became constructed, and then to speak about how challenges to the sex binary actually required policing in order to maintain it. So it's going to be kind of a bimodal lecture. The first part is on the historical emergence and origins of this concept. And the second part is how it continues to police itself in order to maintain its grasp. Okay, so the canonical text on this is by a historian named Dr. Thomas LaCour, who has a really famous book called Making Sex, which was published almost, 30 years ago, but still has not reached mainstream consciousness. So I'm hoping to try to do that with you all. And what Thomas LaCour basically shows us is that actually pre-Enlightenment in Europe, there was not a binary sex model. In fact, there was what he calls a unisex model. So what people believed was that there was one sex, which was male, and that actually females were just considered underdeveloped males. So when you look at the original anatomy drawings of people like Vesalius, they actually don't have different words to describe different bodily parts that we now do. They were all seen as the same. So genitals were just seen as internal genitals and external genitals. And the difference between male and female was not understood as an opposing dichotomy that was antagonistic, but actually the difference was understood as the proportion of heat. So the theoretical concept of the time was that if you had more heat, that determined what your sex was. And at this time, sex was part of a larger cosmological principle about how the universe worked, about why the sun rose, what properties in the world. And there was an inherent idea of a kind of dualism that was incumbent in everything and folded into everything. That was actually about co-evolution, not necessarily antagonism. But what Thomas LaCour, I think, argues so powerfully is that in the late 18th and early 19th century, you see a big departure away from this unisex model that we associate with, say, Aristotle, and we move to a binary sex model. And what the binary sex model actually says is that males and females are not only separate or distinct, but they're in fact opposite and antagonistic. So then what we begin to see is the invention of new languages to describe female bodies as separate from male bodies, new languages to describe intersex people, new bodies to describe things like gender inversion that didn't necessarily have a realm in the culture before. And what some people say is, well, naturally, advancements in science led to people realizing what is the capital T truth, that there are only two sexes. But I think what Dr. LaCour actually argues so powerfully in his work is that it wasn't advances in science that led to the creation of the sex binary. Instead, it was actually advances in politics. So he said political situation shifted, and essentially we needed a new way to justify misogyny. Let me explain. So in no ways do I mean to romanticize the unisex model. The unisex model still understood males as the ideal form of human created in God's image, and Aristotle and all of his dude bros believed in a great chain of being, which understood men as the divine form of human and women as a less divine form. So in no way is the unisex model like the business, right? But at that point, you could justify misogyny using theological principles. So people would use the Bible or people would use religion as a way to dictate denying particular power positions to women. But with advancements in science and technology, and with the Great Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, actually people began to speak about the natural world. So previously, the way that you would justify distributions of power would be about theology or divinity. But then now people started to actually use the natural world to describe why there were distinctions in society. So male scientists needed to justify sexism using the new languages of science that emerge. And I think people don't often learn history of science, but the term scientist really only emerges in the 19th century. Prior to that, people were philosophers and were theologians. Science only really has its kind of progeny in the 19th century, which accompanies sort of scientific revolution of things like different different clinical technologies, experimental technologies that allowed people to actually measure the body. Previously, we didn't have the equipment to actually measure anatomy in the ways that 19th century scientists could. So they began to pursue and elaborate a scientific justification for what became known as the separation of spheres. And this is the principle I really want you to understand when it comes to the sex binary. Okay, I'm feeling a little lonely without the comments. I'm going to turn them on for a second and see if I get distracted. If I get distracted, I'm going to turn them off. For those of you who are just joining, I'm giving a lecture here on the history of the sex binary. If you have questions, put them in the comment section, and all tips go towards the graphic design of these book reports to make this information publicly accessible. Okay, so the separation of spheres. This is a concept I feel like people don't really understand, and I really want you, if there's one takeaway that you have from this lecture, is the idea of the sexual separation of spheres. Okay, so the sexual separation of spheres is basically an ideology that says that women have to exist in the domestic sphere and that men are the only people who are allowed to exist in the public sphere. And this was also about labor. So women's labor was only able to be seen as domestic work or caretaking or birthing, whereas men's work was able to be seen as political discourse. A really great example of this is the term public woman, right? So public women were actually, that was a slur for sex workers. because in the European 19th century Victorian imagination, they couldn't imagine a woman existing in public without a male escort, right? So a public woman was just seen as a low-class, low-brow, working-class sex worker. That's what's really important to understand about the sexual separation of spheres. Now, why is the sexual separation of spheres so important to people in Europe in the 19th century, right? You might have heard of this thing called the French Revolution, right? If you haven't heard of the French Revolution, check it out. Some really great shit went down. And with the French Revolution, you see a new concept emerge, which is that is called inalienable rights. You might have heard of this before, that we're entitled to inalienable rights. This was a really radical notion because prior to that, actually oppression of people was justified on the basis of theology. So people would basically say, the king is closer to God, so actually the reason that you in this feudalistic system are oppressed is because of divine, right? But after the French Revolution, you began to see working people say, hey, we need to have democracy and equal representation. And then you see French women enter the chat, right? So French women enter the chat and they're like, okay, so you're talking about inalienable rights. Does that mean rights for women? And then here's where you see French scientists who literally began to make ridiculous arguments in the 19th century, saying things like the word fetus is close to the word femme in French, which is for woman. And that's why women's role in society is just to be childbirthers. Okay? And so then we see what emerges something called Republican motherhood. So after the French Revolution, what white men basically began to say is the only role of women within the new nation, within modernity, is to be mothers. So even though women were literally fighting alongside people, coming up with ideas, being badass, men were like, nope, actually your only role is to give birth. So the sex binary became the way to justify denying women political rights and saying that women's only role in society should be childbirthing. And that's why it's so upsetting to me to see cisgender women fight for the sex binary now, when in fact the sex binary was created specifically by white men in order to justify the ongoing oppression of white women. Let me give you some examples of how the sex binary was used as a way to justify sexism against women. So women would say, hey, we deserve the right to vote. Inalienable rights means that we should have equal participation in public life. And then men would say, I'm gonna let you finish, but biologically, we did some measurements on your body, and anatomically, because of the size of your hips, you're not able to think. Actually, all of your energy in your body needs to go towards reproduction. So shut up and keep quiet. So then women would say, we want to have access to education. And men would say, actually, if you get educated, your vital nerve energies are not going to be there enough in time for you to give birth. So you need to stay at home so you can basically become an incubation center for kids, right? And so what they would continually argue is that anatomically and biologically, women were somehow less than men and were naturally predisposed to childbirth, whereas men were naturally predisposed to rationality and logic, right? And we're talking about 19th century scientists making arguments like, men have beards, therefore they can think. This was literally 19th century science. And then they would say, women have breasts, therefore they must be childbirthers, right? And in the book, Nature's Body, which I have a review on in the book reports, we talk about Linnaeus, who actually taxonomized animal species. And Linnaeus came up with the term mammal because he was an anti-wet nursing activist. Someone called me, sorry. So Linnaeus basically was like, I don't want white bourgeois women to hire working class women as wet nurses because I'm afraid of the future of the white race. So he said, no, bourgeois women must wet nurse their own children. And so he called mammals, linking the mammary gland to our species as a way to solidify and naturalize the only role of women in society being childbirthing. And this is a really important point to make. This suturing, or this connecting of womanhood and reproduction and birthing, begins with men policing women's knowledge production. So let's go a little bit historically. Women were actually involved in scientific knowledge production in Europe. It's a myth that science was always produced by men. Like, don't let anyone tell you that. That's a lie. Women were actually scientists because at that time, pre-19th century Enlightenment, women were leaders in midwifery. Midwifery was considered a form of science, but then men came in and invented gynecology as a way to make males experts of female anatomy and of the reproductive process and kick out women from knowledge positions of leadership in reproduction, right? Also, cooking and herbs were considered parts of science. So actually, women were often producing medicine and involved in medicinal roles. But with the consolidation of the medical system, actually women were policed out of places where they actually were producing knowledge, right? So it's actually a regression. There was actually women who were producing healing knowledge that was helping society grow, evolve, transcend. And then men enter the chat in the 19th century and they say, no, your only role is to reproduce, right? So what we're saying here is women are actually policed into having one role versus being able to fulfill many different roles. We're not saying that if you reproduce or if you parent, you're complicit with the patriarchy. What we're actually saying is restricting your possibilities to only be one of childbirth was a technology or a device created by patriarchy as a way to justify the separation of spheres, which is that term that I want us to keep returning to. So the separation of spheres was the division of society between the public and the private, and the relegation of women to the private sphere and men to the public sphere. So women, you might have seen this watching Bridgerton on Netflix, by the way. Like, the parlor became emblematic of Victorian womanhood, where basically the woman was just supposed to sit in the parlor while the man goes out and makes all the economic and political and social decisions, right? Because that was the underbelly of how European modernity became defined, right? So misogyny and sexism were foundational to the construction of European modernity, right? And this is really important because now in 2021, Europe will go across the world and shame indigenous peoples for being sexist or patriarchal without actually interrogating how the very consolidation of European nationalism and European modernity was misogyny and the forced confinement of women to the domestic sphere. In fact, the creation of the domestic sphere, right? Because historically, women had had access to different kinds of publics, but with the consolidation of the sexual separation of spheres, women were once relegated to the private realm and men having the public realm. Okay, so the sex binary here is not just about anatomy, it's about women and men's roles in society. And that's what I really want you to understand. So how I was saying, prior, patriarchy was justified using theology. Then in the 19th century with the inventions and science, patriarchy became justified using the rhetoric of science. So the reason that men wanted to create science to prove that there were fundamental, inherent anatomical differences between males and females was such that they could justify the roles that men and women had in society. Does that make sense? So the way that they would justify denying women the right to vote, or denying women the right to teach, or denying women the right to work, or denying women the right to learn, was they would say, this is just the natural order of the universe. Look at your body, right? And this abstraction as the body, as the blueprint for how we make society happen. And that is not true, because women's bodies can do many things, not just reproduce, right? Men were so jealous of women's power. Men were so jealous of women's mysticism, right? And we could have a whole nother lecture here on the history of the word weird, which actually comes from a term that was a slur for witches, right? And so much of the misogyny, the consolidation of misogyny in Europe, was about a dismissal of honestly indigenous witchcraft policies and practices, medicinal herbs of women in Europe. But that's another one. Maybe I'll do a lecture on weirdness sometime. So, what I need you to understand here is that the body became scrutinized as a way to justify the social, political, and economic roles of women and men in society. So intersex people become such a huge threat to the 19th century scientists, because intersex people to the 19th century scientists could be women who are secretly women who are escaping their role in the domestic sphere. So men wanted to identify the intersex people as a way to fix them and put them back into the women's sphere. So when you begin to read the first medical and scientific writing about intersex people, the fear is that intersex people are actually women who are pretending to be men as a way to get access to the public sphere. Right? So that is like wild. And I'm going to be doing a book report on the history of intersex people to really help explain this. But that shows the extent to which men were trying to monopolize power in the public sphere, that they literally read intersex people, who were natural variations of sex diversity, as like secretly women trying to hijack and access male political power. Okay? And they would medicalize and pathologize intersex people as a disorder, as a way to correct them back into the sexual separation of spheres. So, the point being made here is, what Thomas LaCour argues in Making Sex, is any point that someone wants to make about the natural or physiological differences between males and females, in its underbelly has a claim about what roles men and women should have in society. So oftentimes when people are bringing up this idea of biological differences between males and females, or men and women, they're often doing that as a way to justify their patriarchal ideas of women's roles in society. So we can't actually abstract the body from society. What we're taught to notice as biological differences between male and female is because of this social division of society. In fact, biologically, there's more anatomical and physiological variation among the category female than there is between male and female, because guess what? Women are badass, which means that women come in all shapes and sizes. Women come with multiple distributions of body hair. Women come with multiple distributions of hormones and fat. Women come with multiple distributions of strength and height and melanin. Women come with multiple distributions of disability. That actually, this category of biological female and biological male is an inheritance from 19th century's effort to basically reduce the complexity of the body into its reproductive role as a way to justify the sexual separation of spheres. So the reason that it's still kosher to say biological male or biological female is because we're still saying that the role of women in society should just be reproducing agents or machinery, which is just so obnoxious and wrong and violently and irrevocably sexist, right? Like, I think the core of this is misogyny at its core, and it's really important to name that, is that actually assessments are being made about your body without actually asking you, what do you want to do with your body? Assessments are being made about your worth in society without actually saying you get to define your worth in society, right? Okay, so we now have the extreme separation of sexual spheres in the 19th century, where, just to rephrase, men are the ones who are allowed to access the public, women must stay inside. How do you police that boundary? How do you confine white bourgeois women to domesticity and allow men, and right, I'm bringing up white here because the underbelly of the sexual separation of spheres was slavery and colonization, right? The sexual separation of spheres where men defined their manliness by the ability to work and by having women be at home, that was a uniquely white phenomenon because that was not the case among Black and Indigenous communities, right? Under slavery, Black people of all genders were forced to work. So this idea of domesticity or weakness being femininity was a white Victorian value system that didn't apply to the reality of Black and Indigenous women. In fact, Indigenous women have long histories of being leaders in political governance and structures. And in fact, one of the ways that white colonists would justify denying white women the right to vote was they would say, our civilized Anglo society is unlike those savage matriarchies. So one of the ways that Indigenous people were demonized by colonial thinking was by the leadership of women being called savage matriarchies, right? So once again, the sex binary here is invented in the context not just of incredible and profound sexism against white women, but is invented in the context of justifying differences between races. So the invention of the sex binary is interesting because when doctors and scientists, all men, all white men, would write about women, they would only be writing about white women. In fact, when they wrote about women of color or Black women, they would speak about them as lower races. And their idea, womanhood, was only white. And their definition of womanhood was only white because the role of women in white society and in white supremacy was to make the next generation of white men. And so that's really the bluff of how racism and sexism converge, is that white women only mattered to 19th century Victorian scientists in so much as that they could potentially reproduce the next generation of white men. Do you realize, like, how gross that is? Like, it makes me so upset and angry and sad that, like, that the level and the intensity of that sexism of, like, you don't have worth as a woman unless you reproduce a man that can oppress you. Like, ah! So, okay, so we've elaborated here about how the sex binary was created as a strategy to discipline women into the domestic sphere, deny women's leadership, intelligence, science, political representation. Now I want to elaborate around how the sex binary was used as a tactic of racism, and then I'm going to move into how the sex binary continued to police itself into the 20th century. Okay, so when I was saying that when scientists invented this category woman, the Victorian construction of womanhood, the best book on this is called Sexual Science, and it's a book report that I have right on my page called The Sexist History of Biological Sex by a white feminist historian, woman scholar, who's unfortunately passed away but was a Yale historian. It's a phenomenal book. And so basically, I've now shown you how the creation of the differences between the sexes was part of this larger project of dividing society into the sexual separations of spheres, but that was a racial project, and let me explain why. So the predominant scientific paradigm in the 19th century was that the sex binary, or the visual and economic, social distribution of society into male and female, was only accessible by white people, and that people of color, and specifically Black and Indigenous people, had not yet evolved. This is where Charles Darwin's theories of evolution enter the chat. Had not yet evolved to display a visual difference between males and females. So, fashion became very important to this, because what colonists would do is they would go to indigenous cultures across the world and say, look at how the men dress like women and the women dress like men. One of the things they were most obsessed about was that many indigenous women were bare-chested. The original Free the Nipple movement, I said this a million times, begins with indigenous peoples who did not actually see it as a problem for people who we would understand as female assigned at birth now to be shirtless. That was not an issue, right? But when Europeans would look at indigenous fashion presentations, they would see who they perceived to be indigenous men wearing jewelry, makeup, adornment, dresses, skirts, and they would look at who they perceived indigenous women being wearing without a corset or without covering their body as a form of immodesty, right? And they would use that as a way to dehumanize indigenous peoples, as a way to justify colonization, right? So that's why fashion for me is at the foundation of all of this, right? I get a lot of flack oftentimes from other academics or other political activists about why I foreground fashion, but in fact, the very meanings of race and the very meanings of sex were so animated by perceptions of dress and adornment. So actually, what white colonists would do would write long treatises on how Black people and indigenous people adorn their bodies, the ways that they tattooed themselves, the way that they pierced themselves, the way that they dressed, what kind of makeup that they used. And that was all part of an elaborate strategy to dehumanize indigenous peoples, right? And the reason that indigenous peoples needed to be dehumanized was as a way to justify extraction of resources and mass enslavement, right? So the way that we get away with extraction and exploitation of communities is by dehumanizing them and making them into one-dimensional tropes that can then be stolen from and dispossessed of, right? And so the sex binary became a strategy of colonization because what would happen is that white Europeans would say, because indigenous societies across the world don't have this sexual separation of spheres with men leading and women being in the domestic sphere, that's why we must colonize them. So they began to say that the white man's burden was actually about bringing gender norms to indigenous people across the world. And this is a history that we often don't speak about. Often the first leadership positions that white women had in white society was as colonists. White women would basically tell white men, I'm going to go and civilize these indigenous peoples by teaching them gender norms. So I've reviewed books on the subject in the past that white women would go to Native communities and teach Native women how to iron, would go to Native communities and teach Native women how to do domestic work, would teach Native women how to wear a corset, would teach Native women how to cover their chests, would create colonial education systems that told Native men not to wear makeup or not to put on dresses or adornment. And part of this necessarily was the mass murder or attempted genocide of Two-Spirit indigenous peoples in what are now the Americas, Hijra people in what is now South Asia, gender variant people across the world, right? Because, once again, visibly gender non-conforming people, non-binary people, or intersex people, we called into question the sexual separation of spheres. So if you have colonization coming in saying men and women have to be separated, right? Men are in the public sphere, women are in the private sphere. When you have a visibly non-binary person or a visibly intersex person, we call into question the legitimacy and the authority of the colonial state, right? Do you understand that? Like, that is why visibly gender non-conforming people experience so much backlash and ire, is because we call into question the very authority of a state that divides society on these lines of the sexual separation of spheres that says women just belong at home as reproducing agents and men get to have access to political public discourse. And that is why non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, two-spirit people, gender variant people had to be exterminated, right? So the goal of colonial 19th century science was the extermination of our community. And I think that we lose that piece over and over again, and it makes me very sad. They're not just trying to discriminate us to make us feel bad. They're not just trying to discriminate against us to diminish our power and authority in culture. They're trying to discriminate against us to disappear us. The explicit goal is to erase trans people, right? The explicit goal is to erase intersex people and to commit cultural genocide as a way to justify the ongoing projects of patriarchy. So what I am arguing here is that trans and intersex people are foundational to stopping patriarchy because our very existence calls into question the authority of this colonial misogynist project, right? And that's why trans and intersex people are so foundational and necessary to feminism. That's why trans and intersex people have and continue to be so foundational and necessary to feminism, because our existence is politicized under a system that is trying to seek our total and complete genocide and extermination in order to naturalize the sexual separation of spheres. Okay, so now we're going to get into the 20th century and we're going to get into how the sex binary recreates itself even against political challenges against that. And I'm going to talk about two things, which is the history of gendered fashion and the history of women's right to vote. For those of you who are just tuning in, thank you so much to this live lecture. I'm taking tips. All tips go towards paying my graphic designer to make these book reports accessible, because I believe that it should be public knowledge. I believe that history should be a public good. I believe that everyone should learn about the history of colonization, the history of science, the history of fashion. I don't think that we should have to go to private universities to learn this information. I have been lucky to be educated in institutions like Oxford, like Stanford, and to read all of these things. And I'm really trying to use my platform as a way to distill and break down these histories and the scholarship, because I think everyone deserves it. Okay, so in the 19th century, we have the division of society into males and females, the sexual separation of spheres. But women weren't going to take that passively, right? Women have never taken patriarchy passively. In the same ways, we always learn about the history of oppression, but we never learn about the history of resistance. And where there's been repression, there has been resistance. And women have always been protesting the patriarchy. Women have always been dissenting against misogyny, right? And so women did not take being confined to the domestic sphere passively. And in fact, there were two modalities of resistance in the early 20th century, and for those of you who might not know, this is the early 1900s, that really challenged male supremacy and made it shiver in its timbers, shake in its boots. So first, let's talk about sartorial resistance, fashion as resistance, right? So part of the way the sex binary worked was requiring women to wear clothing that was different than men as a way to emphasize the visual distinction between women and men. This meant that women were not allowed to wear pants. And in fact, if women wore pants, they were routinely beaten and physically assaulted. I have primary documents of women going outside in the 1890s and literally getting spat on and beaten, right? For wearing pants in public. And in fact, one of the key strategies of white feminist organizing in the UK and France and Germany and the US in the early 1900s was dress reform. So the feminist dress reform movement, things like the Rational Dress Society in the UK, things like the Bloomer movement in the United States, were actually women saying, we demand the right to wear pants. But the reason they wanted to wear pants was not just about like more options when it came to dress, it was because pants represented the right to navigate the public sphere. So pants basically meant you had legs, meant you could exist in public. And women were basically told you're not allowed to exist in public without escort, right? So pants became politicized because women were actually saying, we want freedom. So at its core, the dress reform movement was not just about fashion, but was about the right for women to exist. A lot of the lectures that famous dress reform activists made, a lot of the books that they wrote at the time, a lot of the arguments that they were making. And what's so interesting is that they would basically say men had to fight for the right to wear pants and navigate the public, and now the time has come for women to have the rights to wear pants. In response to this feminist desire for mobility, to this feminist desire to have access to the public sphere, men doubled down on what we now call cross-dressing legislation, okay? So cross-dressing legislation was created in the 1840s. It was known as the Masquerade Laws. And the explicit purpose of these laws were to punish women for wearing pants in public. Because here is something that they don't teach you. Women would often disguise themselves by wearing pants as a way to go outside and navigate the public sphere. So I remember when I was in grade school, I would learn about westward expansion. But what I didn't learn is that there were many people who were designated female at birth who would essentially take on boys' names, put on, quote, boys' clothes as a way to exist outside and, like, roam freely and, like, have ideas and think and, like, explore culture, right? So, actually, in retaliation to women's mobility, men began to criminalize cross-dressing laws that would literally throw women in prison for wearing pants. It used to be illegal for women to wear pants, right? And that's why it's so upsetting to me when women are upset about men wearing dresses, right? Because women would be thrown into prison for wearing pants because of what that represented. A woman in pants represented a free woman. And men did not want to actually see that. So how did women get the right to wear pants? Was it by respectfully saying, oh, these cross-dressing laws, they're so bad? No. Women won the right to wear pants because it was working women. It was working women who worked in the canary mines. It was working women who worked in the factories. Working women who basically said, I need to fucking wear these pants to do my job. It was lesbian women. It was butch women. It was queer women. It was trans men. It was all of the people that feminism now polices out, whose visibility, whose daily acts of protest challenge the sex binary. So now we're going to relate this to the suffragette movement of the early 20th century and how that's related to fashion. So a lot of people really don't get how radical the idea of women demanding the right to the vote was, right? That shook men. Like, they were not ready to afford women the right to vote because they wanted to distinguish white civilization away from, quote unquote, their words, the savage matriarchies. Women getting the right to vote shook the patriarchal state to its core. So in retaliation, there was mass violence and criminalization of feminist activists. And that's why police brutality has been and will always be a feminist issue, right? Because feminist women were literally beaten by police for organizing. In 1913, when women were outside actually fighting for the right to vote, men would send police to bash them, ruffle them, and take them home and throw them in prison, right? For literally demanding the right to vote. And it's just so upsetting to me that people don't think that direct action and protest is necessary when that's the only way that we got anything, right? So in retaliation to women insisting the right to vote, what did men do? They began to publish images of women as gender nonconforming and intersex as a way to insult women's appearances and as a way to discredit the movement. So what they would say is that only ugly women believe in feminism. And they would say suffragists have facial hair. Suffragists wear pants. Suffragists are really wannabe men. So the first memes, y'all, were created in the early 1900s, were a series of anti-suffrage postcards that depicted women as ugly for demanding the right to vote. So let me break this down for you. Women's legitimate claims to the right to vote, men couldn't have a civil dialogue being like, yeah, right to vote makes complete sense. Yeah, okay. So instead of actually legitimizing that conversation, they created visual culture to insult women's appearances. That is why beauty norms have never been superficial. Beauty norms are actually about instructing and controlling our behavior. Beauty is correlated with behavior. So what men essentially told women is, if you go to vote, then you're going to be ugly. Do you realize how insidious that is? Like that, even just saying it just makes me feel disgusted and totally upset. If you assert your dignity and your humanity, you're ugly. And that became internalized. So that actually those women that were depicted as lesbian, as intersex, as gender nonconforming, as hairy, as cross-dressers, men would call them hermaphroditic for believing in the right to vote. Men would say that they were third sex for believing in the right to vote. Men would and another point here, right? How in a respectable society where women are confined to the domestic sphere and supposed to be protected, how do you then justify public vigilante violence against women through police violence against suffragists? You deny them their womanhood, right? So the way that men could get away with publicly attacking suffragettes was by depicting them as gender nonconforming. What I'm trying to teach you here is the strategy has always been depict people as gender nonconforming, to deny them their humanity, to expose them to violence. So notice how a fundamental strategy of racism, a fundamental strategy of totalitarianism and of fascism has been projecting a community to be gender nonconforming. So I'm going to really wake it up in the chat to the 444 of you. It's not that gender nonconforming people are gender nonconforming. Gender nonconforming people like me literally are just existing. We're just vibing. We're just hanging out. We're just wearing what we want to wear. We're just literally existing in public. We are made gender nonconforming because of society's colonial gender norms. They call us and make us gender nonconforming as a way, it's a character assassination. It's 100-year-plus strategy to depict us as non-human. It's all the state legislatures right now, this very minute, calling non-binary people animals and its. They're trying to dehumanize us, to discredit us as a way to sanction state-sanctioned torture, disappearance, and violence against us. Right? Which is why commenting on our appearance is and has always been a political strategy. The reason that they focus and dwell on what I look like. Oh, Alok is so disgusting. The chest hair, the beard. The reason that they'll continually expose you to images of me literally just vibing in a blue lip. Why not? Is because of this colonial idea that you dehumanize people on the basis of their appearance that begins there in the early 20th century, right? And this is why it's important to learn history, because we learn that the patriarchy uses and recycles the same strategies over and over and over again. And unfortunately, early feminists, rather than siding with lesbians, siding with trans people, siding with gender variant people, siding with communities of color, siding with indigenous people, siding with black people, conceded to white men and pursued respectability as a strategy and told lesbians, trans people, black people, indigenous people, wait your turn. And the thing is, we've been waiting our turn for over 100 years, darling. So what's really important to understand here is that the sex binary as a political strategy recruits people into it and weaponizes them to punish anyone who defies its authority. In the early 1900s, a woman wearing pants challenged the authority of the sex binary, so she had to be thrown into prison. In the now 20 perceived to be men wearing things that are perceived to be feminine challenges the sex binary and the sexual separation of spheres, so the exact same strategies are being used against us now, right? So rather than trying to punish and police people into gender and sex norms, what if we gave up on gender norms? What if, instead of saying these are failed women, instead of saying these are ugly women, what if we said women get to define what being a woman means to them? People know who they are, and these gender norms are holding all of us back. So it seems to me that the only ethical imperative going forward is the cultivation and creation of a society where ultimately people own their own bodies and people own their own expressions, right? So moving beyond the gender binary is not about erasing your right to be a man or a woman. Moving beyond the gender binary is creating a world where all people get to express themselves as who they are and where their worth is not linked to their goddamn appearance. And there is nothing radical about that. What is radical is shaming people for their appearance. What is radical is punishing people into white colonial gender norms. What is radical is about making people feel that they're only worthy of love, worthy of rights, and worthy of dignity if they perform preconceived Victorian ideas of gender. It's not radical to say that gender and sexual diversity exists. It's not radical to say that gender and sexual diversity is. That is the world as it is, right? Okay, so to summarize, I always start these saying, I'm doing a 30-minute lecture, and then I end up going on. I'm sorry, I just get so excited about these things. And for those of you who want book recommendations, look at my last 6 or 7 book reports, and those are what I'm synthesizing in today's lecture on the history of the sex binary. And I think it's really important to say this because there's an orchestrated and elaborate effort to discredit people like me because people don't want to actually engage with our ideas. They want to keep the conversation about our appearance and fear-mongering. But what's really important to understand here, darling, is that I'm a certified expert in the topics that I speak about, and I've read hundreds of books on these subjects. Everything that I'm saying is peer-reviewed, and I have primary documents to supplant my claims. Notice how they will privilege the discomfort of a white cis straight person over the intellectual, epistemological, ontological, methodological interventions of trans and intersex scholars of color who have been doing this work for decades, right? But notice how they will privilege the discomfort over our legitimate scholarship, bibliographies, citational practices, and knowledge production, right? So notice that. Just notice that, how discomfort gets prioritized over truth. So, just to sum, and then I'm going to look at the questions before I close. What I've tried to show you today is that the sex binary, which is the divisions of billions of people into male and female as oppositional categories, was created specifically in the 19th century to justify misogyny against white women and white supremacy against communities of color as a way to justify the global expansion of European empire. In the 20th century, as you began to see racialized people and women actually challenging the sex binary, because feminism was a critique of the sex binary, right? Then you notice that men invent new things like cross-dressing legislation, like these memes, as a way to punish women and people of color back into the sex binary. So what I'm arguing is in the 21st century, we learn from the 19th and the 20th century, and we actually say what true feminism is self-determination and self-declaration. Feminism is the ability to narrate your own life, not the requirement to have to conform to coercive ideas of gender and sex that were created in the 19th century. All right. Thanks so much to the 112 of you for your tips. I'm going to answer any last questions in the question sections. In which countries were the masquerade laws? Really great question. So masquerade laws actually happened all across the world where European colonists invaded. European colonists instituted cross-dressing or masquerade laws in what is now South Asia in an attempt to criminalize and disappear Hijra and gender-variant people. So there's a direct correlation between colonial presence and masquerade laws. Okay, the next question. Why do you think women let sexism and misogyny dictate their gender roles for so long? I guess I want to be a little bit more generous in my response to that. There have always been women who did not comply with misogynist gender norms. There have always been women who have resisted the allure of patriarchal power, right? Even before trans existed as a framework, there were gender dissidents. There were women in the 1700s and 1800s literally owning their own bodies, challenging the patriarchy and misogyny. But what happens is that those women get disappeared from history because they're unruly women, right? So it strikes me that we need to really celebrate the unruly women. It strikes me that we really need to celebrate the women and the trans people who are getting attacked and maligned, because it's those women and those trans people who end up creating cultural paradigmatic shift when no one else was afraid. There have always been women who have sacrificed and compromised their safety in the pursuit of a world that's better for all people. And that's why I will always and have always said that my work begins with feminist resistance, because feminist resistance actually is about locating the resistant act in your own body. Actually saying, my heartbeat is a protest chant, and I'm going to live life on my own terms, which means I'm going to control where my body goes, what it looks like, what I call it, right? My body, my choice is actually about gender and sexual self-determination. The ability to label who you are as a person is one of the most fundamental and compassionate ways of existing in the world. Okay, yeah, some people in the comments saying people are still resisting, we should hold them up. Absolutely. Histories of adornment people really want to learn about. Okay, so if you really want to learn about adornment, the person you have to first read is a Viennese architect named Alfred Loos, and he's a book called Ornament and Crime. And the reason Alfred Loos, I'm making you read this colonist, is because he distills so explicitly how ornament became linked to savagery. And what his basic argument was is, as Europe develops, it moves away from ornamentality towards what we now understand as the modern aesthetic, which is just really glorified prison, right? Like this like steel bars, this very sterile laboratory vibe is what his dream was. And so he basically said ornamentality is a marker of primitivity. And so eugenicists in the US would basically say you can tell how advanced the civilization was on the basis of their art, on the basis of the sculptures they make, on the basis of their architecture, right? And that's why as an artist, I think it's really important to always bring art into this conversation, because ornamentality and aesthetics were always part of the ways in which race and sex became defined. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any other questions here. I'm going to take 2 more and then I'm going to go. Someone's asking about chromosomes. I'm going to post a book report on chromosomes in a few weeks. Stay tuned. Yeah, okay, there's a really great call to action question that I'll answer finally. Yeah, for people who are talking about reading Alfred Loos for architecture school, yes, I find a lot of architects read Alfred Loos. He's kind of canonical in architecture, but they don't actually read his racist writing and like his ideas on civilization. So that's why I think Ornament and Crime is a really fascinating text to consult. So the sort of final question that people are asking is, how do I challenge the institutionalization of colonial gender where I'm at? And I'd love to take that on. So I think the first challenge is calling it what it is, colonial gender. So often when we speak about gender norms, or when we speak about gender stereotypes, we don't actually attribute where those norms and those stereotypes came from. And what I've tried to demonstrate to you today with this history is that those norms and stereotypes come from specific political choices that were made in the context of European empire. There have always been gender and sexual systems across the world, of course, but this current iteration of a sex binary was the creation of an imperialist and colonial project. So when people are saying this is what a man and this is what a woman is or should be, we need to actually link that to this is what colonization has taught us what a man or a woman should be. So it's not that trans and non-binary people are new, it's that colonization has erased trans and non-binary people and our knowledge systems. It's not that actually gender nonconformity is a fashion trend, it's that colonization has erased the long and vibrant tradition and legacy of people existing outside of Western gender norms. So we name colonial gender. Then the second thing that we do is we support the livelihood of trans and intersex, indigenous people, Black people, and people of color. We recognize the sacredness of trans, intersex, BIPOC people who are experiencing the most backlash, the most ire, the most degradation, and the littlest support. It's not enough to support these ideas intellectually or theoretically. We have to support these people, these unruly bodies, whose very existence is willing cultural transformation, right? And if you are a trans or an intersex racialized person, I want to remind you, your very visibility is changing culture. The way that you occupy space, the way that you dress, the way that you navigate your body, that is having reverberations that are undoing colonial gender, because when they see us, they see a possibility of what was, what is, and what will be, right? So we become a viable portal to a world outside of colonial gender, and we teach people that heaven is possible on earth. And that is why we are persecuted, because we present a livable and fleshy alternative to the status quo of latent disassociation mistaken as personality. The next thing that we do to challenge colonial gender is not just supporting trans and intersex racialized people, but challenging how gender norms show up in our own lives. So we're often doing gender norms all the time. We're telling people that's not what a man looks like. That's not what a woman looks like. You shouldn't wear that. We're doing that to ourselves. I can't wear that. What will people think of me? I have to shave. What will people think of me? And I want you, every time you have that voice in your head, to ask, where did that come from? Who taught me that a man or woman should look like this, act like this, be like this? Why is that there? That is there to restrict me. That is there to restrict the people that I love. So I dissent. So you need to dissent from gender norms in your own life. That is not the same thing as saying be non-binary, right? People always mistake what I'm saying as, Alok, you think that if I'm a woman, I'm a son. No, you can be a woman, you can be a man. That's totally fine. I'm less concerned with destinations as much as I am concerned with journeys. Where you end up is far less important to me than how you end up there. And how you end up there is about challenging what you've been told, unlearning the norms that you've been given, and actually carving out a life for yourself and saying, this is who I am and I chose it. And it's willing to change because change is the natural order of the universe. Let's go. And it's about supporting people in your own life to challenge gender norms. It's about saying, oh, these people in my family and my friend groups that are doing things that are off the conventional path, we're going to support them. It's about challenging people who are upholding gender norms. So it's not just about supporting trans and intersex people. It's about challenging the people who are making our lives so impossible to begin with. Why are people still out here using terms like biological male and biological female with no actual understanding of what that means? Why are people still policing people into gender and sex norms and pretending like that's feminism? That's not. So we challenge these gender norms to create a world that celebrates possibility and that celebrates emotionality and creative self-expression. So the way that we end colonial gender is not, and I really want people to understand this, because I think masculinity has made us understand revolution in a way that I don't believe. For me, revolution is happening right now, because I learned revolution from James Baldwin, who says, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. And what James Baldwin actually teaches us is that our life is a miracle, which means that there are daily acts of miracles and magic that are happening right now. This knowledge was not supposed to reach you. It was calcified in academic tomes to keep history away from you, and yet we found a way to make it reach you, right? So we're doing impossible things, and we're living impossible lives, and that means hope is the only choice, because hope means that we're here. Hope means that you're receiving this knowledge. Hope means that we might never meet each other, but we love each other. Hope means that we can love each other right now. So the ways that we can practice daily descent to the colonial gender binary is not by waiting for some messiah figure to come and rescue us from the cataclysmic flood of gender norms, but is actually practicing a daily religious practice of resistance to create a better world. So ask yourself, how am I not waiting for the better world, but creating it now? How do I treat people with love and compassion rather than waiting for love and compassion to be there? What I tell people is we're constantly making the world. The world is a performance art piece that is constantly being made. So what we can do is take an active role in making something better. So think about it. How do I create safer spaces? How do I create spaces where people are loved for who they are? How do I create spaces where people can mess up? How do I create spaces where people are allowed to be ignorant? How do I create spaces where people are allowed to be compassionate to one another? How do I create empathetic and earnest spaces? How do I respond to vitriol with love? How do I create love and mobilize love, right? So I guess my final answer to that question of how do we move beyond colonial gender is by not doing the same mistake that colonization did to us back to them. I'm not trying to recolonize. And to recolonize means I meet them at their frequency. And their frequency is one of scarcity, is one of fear-mongering, is one of violence, is one of invalidation, is one of fear-mongering. I'm not interested in doing that, darling. I'm going to respond my entire life to all of the hate and the animus that I receive with a kind of love that is so powerful. It reminds me of what my favorite writer, Ocean Vuong, says. I'm paraphrasing, yikes, I'm guilty in the details, but he says basically, I want to love more than death can harm. I want to love more than death can harm. And I think that is one of the most powerful and beautiful commitments there is to live in the world, to love more than death can harm. And so when we're trying to think about how to resist colonial gender, we don't resist colonial gender by shaming people. We don't resist colonial gender by making people feel like shit. We don't resist colonial gender by pretending that we're better than people. We don't resist colonial gender by dragging people. We don't resist colonial gender by making people feel small. We resist colonial gender by making people feel expansive. We resist colonial gender by making people feel redemptive. We resist colonial gender by allowing people to mess up and grow. We resist colonial gender by actually creating a hopeful, loving, nurturing, ebullient world for all people. What we can learn from what the early suffragettes got wrong is they conceded their dignity in order to access immediate equality. And when we concede our dignity for equality, we've already lost, right? When we concede our dignity for equality, we've already lost. Because even if we have the rights, we're not alive to receive them. And don't compromise your dignity. Don't compromise your earnesty. Don't compromise your vulnerability. Don't compromise your compassion. Don't compromise your heart. And I notice that so many people in queer and trans movements have to compromise their love, compromise their intimacy, compromise their hope in order to be seen as revolutionary. And that's why I say, fuck that. In Alok's revolution, it's a loving revolution. In Alok's revolution, it's a compassionate and needy revolution. It's a revolution where we forgive. It's a revolution where we hold and we embrace the multiplicity of one another, where we're so committed to one another because we need each other. It's a revolution that fights for dignity. It's a revolution that needs everyone. I don't just want trans and intersex people of color in my revolution. I want everyone. I want even the white cis straight men who've never thought about trans feminism. I want the TERFs. I want everyone here on board because we're going to actually create a loving revolution, right? And I think that's the only way that we'll win, right? I feel like we keep on making the same mistake. We keep on using the same strategies of carcerality, the same colonial tactics of shame. I was born, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again, I was born with 2 lungs, I was born with a tongue, and I was born with a fist, and I was not born with shame. And the most radical thing I've ever done in my life is liberate myself from shame and recognize that this shame is not organic, it is imposed. The shame was put on me by a society that created that shame to separate me from my magic. And in fact, when you emancipate yourself from shame, you find your magic. And in that magic is the substance of revolution. So the way that we create revolution is by emancipating ourselves from cultures of shame. And that's what the sex binary was. It is institutionalized, calcified, stagnant shame. That's why when we see these 108 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation, they're doing it because they want to shame us. And that's why as LGBTQ people, we internalize that shame. We feel ugly, we feel wrong, we feel disorderly, we feel broken, we feel like we have something to prove. What if we began from the premise that we have nothing to prove? What if we began from the premise that we're inherently lovable? What begins from the premise when we say, this is who I am, take it or leave it? What begins from the premise that we say what we love about humanity is our ambivalence? What we love about humanity is the delicacy of being a human, is that we are fragile and unfurling. That's the kind of humanity I'm fighting for. I'm not just resisting gender norms, I'm fighting for humanity. And I think that's the distinction. Moving away from a framework that only understands resistance to actually moving to a framework that understands creative imagination. I am so far less impressed by people who can rehearse and regurgitate a series of analysis tearing apart something as much as I am with innovators. And that's why I love artists. And I want to say a final plea to the artists, because this lecture has gone on way too long, but I'm having fun, so why not? Thank you so much to the 140 people for the tips. But a final plea to the artists, right? A final plea to the artists is don't let anyone discipline you out of your hopefulness. Don't let anyone discipline you out of your creative self-potential. What is needed more than anything in the world right now is imagination. What is malnourished in this world is imagination. What we need to harness is imagination. So bless the daydreamers. Bless the daydreamers. Bless the ideologues. Bless the people who are dismissed as naive and idealistic. Bless the people who are earnest. Bless the people who are hopeful, because those are the people who in the midst of despair are going to actually create delight. Those are the people who in the midst of death are going to create life. Those are the people who got us here. They're the people who created despite being hunted. They're the people who alchemized the kinds of vitriol and violence and turned it into something more vitalist, more vivacious. They're the people who are fighting for life. Artists fight for life. So fight for your artistry, right? Fight for your right to imagine. And surround yourself with people who understand the kernel of your possibility, who will believe in your artistry, because you're going to live in a world that is going to try everything it can to disappear your magic and to indoctrinate you into a gravity blanket of shame. And I have felt it my entire life. Every insult is a gravity blanket of shame. It is what I first remembered, my earliest memories of self-expression and having people say, you are too much. It is that overwhelming sense of I'll only be loved if I disappear myself. I say, fuck that. Artists teach us that we are worthy of love for being, not for doing. Artists teach us that we are worthy of love for our radiant existence, not for our labor. That shame is not organic, right? Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to today's lecture. Thanks for all the tips. And check out the book reports that I have. I think 7 or 8 that I touched upon in this lecture. They're really quite fantastic books, and if you don't have the time to read them all, I've synthesized them in those book reports. And I just want to let you know I'm thinking about you. I love and adore you. I'm so grateful for you. I'm rooting for you. And I wanted to share one final thing. I know I said this 6 times, but I'm going to final do it. When I say I'm rooting for you, I mean that in the double valence of the word. Rooting, not just in terms of cheerleading for you, but rooting as in setting roots for you, so that I'm here to hold you down on this earth. And I know that it might feel difficult right now to be here on this earth, but there are those of us who are rooting for you, meaning we're here, and we're going to connect you to this ground so that when you can touch it, you can feel it too. So let's root for each other always. Let's continue to offer compassion in the face of malice, and let's support one another in creating a dynamic and irresistible revolution of compassion, transformation, and the liberation from colonial gender and the sexual separation of spheres. Okay, I'm going to give a last few minutes if people want to give any tips, and all those go towards the graphic designer for the book reports, and I'll catch you later.